Peter J. Robichaud, and I brought in a Sea King pilot's chemical protection flying coveralls and a cooling vest as part of the Shearwater Aviation Museum's collection. During the Gulf War, there was a persistent chemical threat, and just about every coalition, field force, air force, wore some version of protective equipment.
Responding to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, the United States led a coalition of United Nations in the 7-month-long Persian Gulf War. Kuwait, though small, was targeted for its richness in oil. Flailing from its deficits of recent conflicts against Iran, Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, was intent on escaping repayment. As one of the 35 UN members in America's corner, Canada invested its air and naval forces, marking the first time the two units would directly support one another during combat under its united armed forces. Pressured by operations like Desert Shield and the ubiquitous multi-pronged Desert Storm, Iraq succumbed to defeat. Over 4,000 Canadians contributed to the liberation of Kuwait during the Gulf War, and many more in post-war peacekeeping missions.
Well, I'd like to welcome Peter J. Robichaud back from the Shearwater Aviation Museum with another interesting item. You brought a friend along today, Peter.
Yes, I did. I brought a really classy-looking individual dressed in what is known as a CBRN suit or an NBCW survival suit. As you know, the military loves acronyms. So the acronym CBRN being Chemical, Biological, Radioactive, and Nuclear Defense, and its former acronym being NBCW, Nuclear, Biological, Chemical Warfare Defense. This is a suit designed to survive those environments.
So typical time frame we're looking at is 1990. This is a Gulf War Sea King pilot's MBWC gear.
That's correct. It is first Gulf War survival gear. Including with that is the respirator, as you can see, and his cooling vest, which is a unique item to the Sea King's operating crew.
In 1990, when they went to the Gulf War, obviously they were going in an environment that really they had not really operated in before. One of the biggest innovations actually was the vest.
Right, as you can imagine, just operating in the Middle East in a hot aircraft in a normal flight suit would be rather arduous, but put on this effectively what is a charcoal-lined snowsuit, and now you can imagine how hot the crewmen can get. So this necessitated the innovation of this unique vest, as you can see. It's just a simple zip-on vest with a Kevlar liner, and also behind the Kevlar liner is a liquid and air-cooled system which pumps and circulates water and air all throughout the vest and providing the airmen some measure of comfort.
And in fact, you actually had to wear one for 4 days.
The longest time I've ever worn this particular type of suit has been 4 days on a training exercise, and I can tell you that that was 4 days of absolute nightmare. Everything is just broken down. You're operating in a surreal world looking through lenses. You can't hear anything, you can't shout at the people you're trying to communicate with, and just the overall heat of wearing this. In my particular circumstance, I was wearing it in a tank, which is a giant metal box, in a hot environment in Fort Hood, Texas. So you can imagine the heat of Texas in a metal box wearing one of these suits. It's quite disgusting.
So the Sea King sent to the Gulf War were part of Operation Friction, which was the Canadian contingent's operational. So the Navy went, the Air Force went, and the Sea Kings were attached to the Navy group, and they were actually in operational duty throughout that time. The Sea Kings were used for utilitarian work to some degree, but they also were armed at this point, I would say most of the time.
Right, they did carry a 7.62 C6 machine gun out the side of the back of the cargo hatch, operated by the Airborne Electronic Systems Operators, ASOPs. And they, I don't believe, fired any shots in anger per se, but a lot of surveillance activity was conducted, and the machine gun would obviously provide a measure of standoff capability for the Sea King itself. Rather than getting right over top of the thing and be able to cover it, it can now stand off a few hundred meters away from the target and still have some measure of protection.
And also they have the chaff and they have the anti-flare systems as well.
Right, the self-protection gear employed on the Sea King, chaff and flare boxes. I don't know, once again, if they were actually ever used, but I certainly know of a few instances where the Sea Kings were actually locked onto by hostile radar systems.
So it's 1990, we're in the Gulf. It's a pretty hostile environment. What sort of threats are being thrown at them at this point?
Well, aside from the actual kinetic threat, which was minimal for the actual Sea King crews themselves, the biggest threat was a threat of chemicals or some sort of biological or perhaps even a radiological agent. Saddam Hussein daily threatened to use some kind of chemical or some Scud missile attack, something along those lines, almost every day I recall from the Gulf War.
So the environment, obviously, Iraq was firing missiles off, and they were Scud missiles.
Scuds were generally a threat throughout the entire Gulf War. They're a long-range rocket, loosely based on the design of the German V-2 rocket of the Second World War, but adapted by the Soviets in the early 1960s for use of any kind of chemical warhead or even a high explosive warhead, things of that nature, to be lobbed at long ranges at your enemy forces.
Saddam Hussein had used chemicals prior to the Gulf War, and the Iraq-Iran War, there had been some notes of chemical use then. In this particular war, there was always more the threat of anything, and this was the reasoning behind having the crews operational with that equipment and wearing it most of the time they were flying. The Allies at that point were unsure really what was going to be thrown at them.
Chemical warfare is the oldest known form of warfare. You can go back to the medieval times when they were launching cattle infested with plague beyond the walls of a castle, and now everyone's infected with it. The Chinese even used barges filled with sulfur, lit on fire, and slammed them into enemy vessels in the hopes that the chemicals would drift on down and incapacitate their foes. It's nothing new, and to this day it is a consistent threat. So interesting that this suit is still being used by the Canadian military to this day, albeit in a slightly different modified form. It's a little lighter now, and there's some water resistance to it. And currently being used by the Canadian Forces to this day.
Well, thank you, Peter, for bringing this item from the Shearwater Aviation Museum. It's a fine example of one of Canada's significant post-war operations, Operation Friction. You can actually see this on display at the museum when you go to the museum.
That's right. It's currently in its full state on display at the museum in our Gulf War section of the museum.
Well, thank you again, Peter, for bringing this particular item along. And it's another great example of innovation and change in technology and flight safety equipment that we see today.
My pleasure, Mark.
What we see is a piece of military equipment that we used 30 years ago. It's now in a museum, but the elements and the basic principles are still used today in today's environment.